Yeah, riots tearing through the streets, hundreds raging outside a migrant hotel.
Rising crime has intensified public concern. Analysts report a surge in street crime in London, including frequent mobile phone thefts by organised groups on mopeds, often carried out with apparent impunity. Metropolitan Police data shows that only a small proportion of such crimes are resolved, raising serious questions about enforcement capacity. Violence involving bladed weapons is also increasing, with machete-related incidents rising in urban centres and zombie knives sold online. Medical professionals treat injuries more typical of conflict zones, while authorities warn that younger individuals increasingly carry weapons for personal safety. In northern regions, long-standing concerns about organised exploitation networks have resurfaced. Investigations suggest these operations remain active, with vulnerable individuals at risk of trafficking and abuse. Critics argue that authorities have hesitated to act decisively due to fears of accusations of discrimination. Burglary rates have reached worrying levels, with limited police response in some communities, reinforcing perceptions of a deteriorating security environment. The political implications are significant. Prime Minister Starmer, formerly Director of Public Prosecutions, built his reputation on law and order expertise, yet critics say justice system weaknesses persist. Declining conviction rates and reduced police resources have undermined deterrence. Critics point to cases such as a 19-year-old carrying a machete receiving a suspended sentence and suspects in organised exploitation investigations released on bail. For opponents, these outcomes reflect broader institutional failure rather than isolated judicial decisions. Many observers note the public expected a decisive crackdown on crime, but instead have seen institutional failure. Each reported theft, property damage, and violent incident is seen as evidence of governmental weakness. Critics argue the Prime Minister has the authority and expertise to implement reform, but lacks the political resolve to take difficult measures. Where the government frames restraint as de-escalation, many voters see it as retreat. Public anxiety has spread beyond major cities into suburban communities. Ordinary citizens perceive an imbalance in state enforcement, strict oversight for some, while individuals entering the country irregularly receive accommodation and support. This perceived disparity has fueled resentment and redirected frustration toward political leadership.
That this violent mob do not represent our country.
Social tension spreads rapidly through public discourse, with anger directed not only at disturbances but at the leadership accused of enabling them. Critics see this as a broader failure of governance driven by internal neglect rather than external threats. During early unrest, regional security officials reportedly sought permission to deploy specialized units, but the Home Office emphasized containment, dialogue, and avoidance of escalation. Supporters describe this approach as measured, while opponents see it as failure to confront rising disorder. The term community tensions itself is disputed. Critics argue it downplays criminal activity and prevents decisive enforcement. Hesitation at the highest levels appears influenced by concern over public perception rather than operational necessity, suggesting ministers fear political consequences more than instability. Sources describe what critics call institutional paralysis, with crime and immigration policies constrained by fears of appearing hardline even as social division intensifies. Opposition figures accuse the government of prioritizing reputation management over national security, focusing on polling and public messaging instead of decisive action. Government supporters maintain that policy balances enforcement and civil liberties, but public perception of hesitation has eroded confidence. Critics also argue the crisis was not unforeseen. Local authorities submitted assessments highlighting rising violent crime, exploitation networks, financial pressures from migrant accommodation, and sustained migration flows. Opponents say these warnings required urgent intervention but produced no comprehensive policy change. Government advisors cite legal and ethical constraints, especially regarding human rights, on proposed deportation measures. Critics argue argue these must be balanced against public safety, warning that inability to secure borders risks domestic disorder. Opposition leaders contend that border enforcement has weakened, violent crime increased, and law enforcement authority diminished. They argue ideological priorities have contributed to paralysis at Westminster, with official statements often focusing on political discourse rather than immediate security challenges. Analysts note governmental legitimacy erodes gradually through declining public trust, with accumulated failures in security, justice, and governance widening the gap between the state and its citizens. Economic pressures compound the debate. Critics argue rising taxation and public spending disproportionately affect working households while failing to address social challenges. Businesses report restricted operations in high-crime areas, and healthcare services face mounting strain. Government officials cite broader structural factors, while critics link pressures to immigration and population growth. Public discussion increasingly focuses on the government's pledge to reduce irregular migration. Opposition figures say continued flows reflect ideology over administrative limits. Within Parliament, government representatives emphasize diversity and international cooperation, while critics argue rapid demographic change occurred without public mandate. Each new migrant accommodation contract is seen by opponents as a shift toward permanent settlement rather than deportation. Government supporters maintain such measures reflect humanitarian and legal obligations. As the political crisis deepens, the central question remains: do current policies represent responsible governance in a complex global environment, or a failure to maintain security and public confidence? The answer may ultimately shape the future direction of British politics. As the nation grapples with rising crime, social tension, and widespread public anxiety, the coming months may prove decisive in shaping the country's future. From the streets of London, where organized groups carry out thefts with apparent impunity, to northern towns still haunted by exploitation networks, citizens are confronted with threats that test not only their personal safety but their faith in institutions. Violence involving bladed weapons, the pressures of migration, and perceptions of uneven enforcement have created a climate of fear and frustration reaching into suburban communities as well as major cities. At the same time, political leaders face mounting scrutiny over their choices, with critics highlighting delays, hesitations, and the balance between operational action and public perception. Questions about justice, accountability, and governance dominate public discourse as each reported crime incident of disorder and unresolved threat seems to underscore a deeper crisis of institutional confidence. The consequences of inaction or action taken too slowly could reverberate far beyond immediate security concerns, influencing the relationship between the state and its citizens for years to come. Citizens are looking for decisive leadership, clarity of purpose, and tangible results, not only measures that prevent crime, but also policies that rebuild trust, strengthen institutions, and address the social and economic pressures underlying unrest. Yet, the government's handling of these challenges, from law enforcement directives to migration management, is seen by many as emblematic of a broader struggle to balance civil liberties, operational effectiveness, and political accountability. In this moment of uncertainty, the eyes of the nation remain fixed on leadership. The choices made now will determine whether public confidence can be restored or whether the sense of institutional failure will deepen, leaving ordinary citizens feeling increasingly vulnerable and unheard. The unfolding crisis is not just a test of policy, but a test of governance, responsibility, and vision, and it calls for decisive action, clear communication, and an unwavering commitment to the safety and well-being of all citizens. How these challenges are met or left unaddressed will shape not only the immediate future of public safety, but the long-term trajectory of trust between the government and the people it serves. For viewers watching this unfold, the question remains: will the nation rise to meet these challenges with strength and clarity, or will hesitation and inaction continue to widen the gap between authority and the people?